Robert Baratheon was never a man to dream of dragons. In his youth, he was a brute of a warrior, full of mead and lust, with little patience for the superstitions or ancient wonders of the Targaryens he had deposed. Yet, after years of ruling a kingdom that resisted his heavy hand and deep thirst, after the gold of the crown's coffers had run to naught, after the stirrings of rebellion in the north and the restlessness of lords in the Reach, after all this, Robert found himself desperate enough to consider the impossible. The day he first contemplated the thought was humid and oppressively hot. The sun perched high and cruel upon King's Landing. He sat upon the Iron Throne, a huge man grown soft with age and drink, yet still formidable in the breadth of his shoulders and the thunder of his voice when his temper sparked. His hair had gone mostly gray, his face was ruddy, and his belly strained against the leather of his tunic. Over a decade had passed since he had smashed Rhaegar Targaryen upon the trident, but the memories of that victory had soured. Peace had come, yet so had languor and waste. The realm was restive, and Robert was soul-tired. He felt cornered, harried by the debts to the Iron Bank, by the whispers that the Targaryen girl across the sea might bear dragons once more, by the fractious lords who bristled beneath his taxes and demands. On the throne's dais, Varys stood quietly, the master of whisperers somehow managing to look both benign and calculating. Peter Baelish, with a mocking smile curling his lips, reminded the king of just how much money the realm owed and how the crown might soon default unless new revenues were secured. Ser Barristan Selmy, still a paragon of knightly virtue in Robert's eyes, stood nearby, his gaze filled with concern for the king's health and for the security of the realm. Yet none of them understood the glimmer of an idea that flickered in Robert's mind. Only the queen, Cersei Lannister, standing near the throne, eyes cold and bright, guessed the shape of it. What if we had dragons of our own? Robert's mind drifted there to a heretical thought. For years he had scorned anything to do with Targaryen tradition. He had ripped that dynasty from the throne, had shattered its last scion's chest with his warhammer, had exiled Viserys and Daenerys so thoroughly that only the rumor of them floated across the narrow sea. But rumor was enough. Perhaps the girl truly had married a Dothraki horse lord. Perhaps she truly was searching for a way to rekindle the dragonfires that once forged her lineage's might. And if she succeeded, Robert let that flicker grow. He remembered the hush that used to fill the Red Keep's halls whenever the old Targaryens walked by, the sense of dread and awe that dragons had inspired. He could imagine that dread and awe harnessed by him, Robert Baratheon, first of his name. Once, House Baratheon owed its existence to Targaryen conquest. Orys Baratheon had been rumored a bastard brother to Aegon the Conqueror himself, though such stories were half lost in the swirl of time. Now, ironically, might the ancient Targaryen magic be the key to restoring Baratheon's supremacy? He refused to speak of this notion openly, but that night, after Cersei had come to his bedchamber only to leave when he turned her away in a sour mood, he paced the long corridors of the Red Keep alone. Torchlight glimmered against the stone, and each flambeau revealed a shadow of Robert's younger self on the walls, a silhouette that soared taller and prouder than he felt. He could still feel the phantom heaviness of his warhammer, smell the blood of Rhaegar. If only things had ended there, he thought. If only the realm had found a golden age in the years that followed. But kingship was a burden he had never truly wanted, and that unwillingness had cost him. Drink, hunts, and whores had replaced the vigor of youth. He had neglected the realm, leaving the governance to Lannisters and schemers. Now, the realm teetered, and Robert dreaded the possibility that soon he would lose all. As the midnight bells chimed faintly throughout King's Landing, Robert found himself standing before the massive skull of Balerion the Black Dread, hidden in the depths of the Red Keep's underbelly. He could not recall what drunken impetus brought him there, only that the emptiness in him had guided his feet. Once, these dragon skulls had been displayed in the throne room as trophies, but the Targaryen relics had been banished into the darkness where few ever ventured. Their silent, gaping jaws seemed to mock him. He approached the largest skull, the one that had belonged to Aegon's greatest beast, a dragon so vast it had overshadowed armies and melted castles. The hollow sockets of its eyes glared back at the king. A single stub of a horn jutted from the brow, chipped from some old blow. Robert raised a trembling hand, feeling the rough edge of the dragon bone. A whisper, half-formed, slithered in his mind. How unstoppable would you be if only you had the means to conjure living fire? He stood there for an hour, weaving dream and memory. For the first time in years, he felt that old excitement, the kind that had fueled him in the rebellion. He thought of the Targaryen seat in Dragonstone, of the lore that said hidden chambers in that bleak fortress might contain secrets of Valyria. He thought of the rumored eggs that might still lurk in the Seven Kingdoms, secreted away by lords either too proud or too ignorant to bring them forward. He imagined forging alliances with sorcerers, conjurers, priests of R'hllor, anything to bring the unstoppable power of dragons into his own hands. The notion was madness, yet Robert, driven by desperation, felt madness was all that remained. In the days that followed, he began to confide, in the smallest hints, with Grand Maester Pycelle. He demanded ancient records be brought from the library. He insisted that Pycelle locate tomes of Valyrian lore that had survived the Targaryen purges after the Doom. He was not subtle, and he knew that word of this inquiry would leak to the spider's ears. Yet he did not care. Let them whisper. It would be the bravest who dared question him openly. A moon's turn later, Pycelle presented him with a worn grimoire of sorts, titled The Fires of Valyria, so old that its pages crumbled at the edges. Within its brittle covers lay references to the forging of dragonsteel, to the rearing of hatchlings, to spells and incantations that only half made sense to the maester. Pycelle offered caution and skepticism, but Robert dismissed them. His mind was set. He had resolved that if Targaryen magic could be revived across the sea, then by the gods, Robert would bring it to Westeros first. By the time the harvest brought a stench of rotting refuse to the city's streets, Robert had begun to gather a secret circle of advisors. Among them were pyromancers from the Alchemists' Guild, long overshadowed by the Targaryens' downfall, but keepers of arcane knowledge nonetheless. He summoned red priests from the Wharf, refugees from Volantis or Lys, who might have knowledge of fire magics. He even queried Mirri Maz Duur's name from Qohor's rumor, though that name came to him only in scattered references. He sought to unify them all in a singular purpose: conjure, hatch, or otherwise produce living dragons, loyal to House Baratheon. Yet to Robert's frustration, months passed with no result. Instead of living dragons, he got only half-baked potions, flares of green flame, illusions that quickly faded. The city grew uneasy with talk of dark arts rumored to be carried out in the Red Keep's depths. The lords swore they heard strange cries in the night. Even the rats beneath the castle seemed to flee. Robert watched with mounting anger as the gold he spent yielded no tangible result. The Red Keep's corridors were rife with the stench of burned hair and sulfur. Cersei gave him that cold, calculating stare more often than not, but said little. Tyrion Lannister, who visited King's Landing on some business for his father, threw Robert a few wry jests about conjuring Targaryen ghosts. The entire scheme felt a humiliating charade. Then, on a storm-lashed night, the Red Priests' chanting bore fruit. Sparks danced in the air, swirling embers that flickered red against the damp walls of the secret chamber Robert had prepared. He stood at the periphery, clad in plain leather, heart pounding in his chest. Cersei stood at his side, lips parted slightly in something like awe. The alchemists poured wildfire into a great brazier, fueling the glowing orb of heat that spat flame upward. The chanting reached a crescendo, an ancient incantation in the Valyrian tongue. As lightning cracked outside, sending thunder reverberating through the night, one of the Magi let loose a guttural cry, holding aloft a small stone egg, veined with silver, the color of deep sapphire. The surface glimmered with molten streaks. Robert watched, transfixed, as the flames licked the egg. Then came a sudden hush, a sensation as if the air itself had been sucked from the room. A single crack appeared along the surface of the egg. Robert had never heard a sound quite like the squeal that followed. It was weak, reedy, like a babe's first cry, yet it came from the egg, from the living embryo inside. As the flames danced higher, tongues of green and red swirling into blinding brightness. The egg shattered. Bits of shell pattered onto the stone floor. A small, scrawny creature emerged, black as coal, eyes red as rubies. Its wings were damp membranes, trembling as it struggled to free itself from the broken shell. Smoke coiled around its form, and Robert heard a collective gasp from everyone in the chamber. The stench was sulfur and blood. It was a dragon, living and breathing. It might have been no larger than a small cat, but it shrieked a challenge into the world as though it were Balerion reborn. Robert realized his fists had clenched. His breath came in ragged bursts. Then, a grin, slow and almost feral, spread across his face. He turned to Cersei, who stared with parted lips, her green eyes reflecting the flame's glow. In that moment, the King of the Seven Kingdoms knew that the unimaginable had come to pass. There would be a new age in Westeros, one guided not by Targaryen might, but by Baratheon will. Life with the hatchling was not simple, nor was it guaranteed to thrive. The creature needed constant warmth, and the pyromancers devised a system of braziers in the bowels of the Red Keep, a hidden chamber thick with heat and magical wards. The Red Priests offered prayers to Lawler, though Robert disliked their foreign god. He tolerated them only because they seemed to have had a hand in the dragon's hatching. Every day, Robert descended those winding stairs to witness the little beast feed on goats and small dogs. Its appetite was ravenous, and as weeks slipped by, it began to grow. The black scales hardened, the wings stretched, smoke curled from its nostrils. It snapped at any who dared approach, except for Robert and an old alchemist named Garmin, who spoke to it in soft, cooing tones. Robert named the dragon Stormclaw, after the storm that had raged on the night it was born. On a whim, and with a whiskey-fueled grin, Robert commanded a new banner be designed. The crowned stag of Baratheon wreathed in dragonfire, a blasphemous twist that stirred resentment in many corners of the realm. Word spread in hushed whispers that the king had tamed a black WIRM, that the new dynasty would not be a restoration of Targaryen lines but something else entirely. Unrest simmered. In the north, Eddard Stark heard the rumors and was appalled by what he considered an unholy betrayal of everything Robert had once stood for. If the king had stooped so low as to dabble in dark arts, could Ned, in good conscience, remain loyal? Yet the old bonds of friendship and duty still weighed heavily on the Lord of Winterfell. The north stirred uneasily, uncertain whether to believe the travelers' tales of black dragons in the sky. In the Vale, Jon Arryn's passing had left young Robert Arryn under the guidance of Lisa Tully, and there was no certain loyalty there either. The boy's mother whispered poison about the new threat from King's Landing. But none of this halted Robert's ambition. Spurred by Stormclaw's success, the alchemists and Red Priests hastened to hatch more eggs. Several attempts failed, resulting in lumps of charred eggs that reeked of death. But 2 more hatchlings emerged in time. A green-scaled female with crest-like spines along her neck, named Jadefire, and a whitish, pallid male with pink-tinged wings, eerily silent. Robert named that one Ghostwing. Each success fanned the king's mania for power. Even Cersei, once scornful of Targaryen relics, began to drape herself in black and gold, eyes gleaming with a strange light whenever she visited the dragons. By the time these 3 dragons had reached the size of large dogs, the transformation of King's Landing was undeniable. Rumor had spread to every corner of Westeros. The small folk lived in awe and fear. Their king had dragons. In the shadows, conspiracies blossomed. Old lords who had lost loved ones in the rebellion whispered that Robert had grown mad like the Targaryens before him. The faith of the Seven was alarmed by the notion of blood magic and foreign priests skulking in the Red Keep. Tywin Lannister, in the Rock, fumed at the knowledge that House Baratheon's crown might no longer require the gold of House Lannister to sustain it. Who needed loans when you had the threat of dragonfire to subjugate the realm? Robert felt all of those tensions, but in a strange way he thrived upon them. He felt more alive than he had in years. No longer just an aging, half-drunken king, he was something else. He had harnessed the magic of an extinct dynasty. At last, he had found a decisive means to crush rebellion, to ensure the 7 kingdoms bowed in truth. He would be the second coming of a conqueror, forging a new era of absolute monarchy in Westeros. Yet the dragons were not mere beasts to be trained like hounds. They were cunning in their own right, savage in appetite. Stormclaw especially displayed a fierce will, resisting any attempts to bind him. A few times, the black dragon seared the arms of caretakers or snapped at Garmin the alchemist. Only Robert's presence, exuding a strange aura of dominance, seemed to pacify Stormclaw. As for Jadefire, she was sly, prone to escape her lair at night, gliding through the dark sky, scaring the city watch senseless. Ghostwing was eerily quiet, watchful. Some said that strange illusions flickered around him, as though he exhaled not flame but mist. The Red Priests insisted each dragon reflected aspects of the fire god's will. Robert paid no heed. He only cared that the beasts continued to grow and remained bound to him alone. Finally, the day came when Robert decided to reveal Stormclaw publicly. He had the black dragon harnessed in reinforced chains of iron, fitted with plates that bore the stag and dragon sigil. The beast roared and exhaled a short jet of flame, sending half the stable hands scurrying for cover. Robert only laughed and strode forward, clad in black leather and gold studs, heart pounding in his chest. A handful of watchers stood in the yard. Some knights, some alchemists, a handful of courtiers. Robert climbed onto Stormclaw's back, feeling the leathery scales shift beneath his weight. The dragon smelled of sulfur and hot metal. Its wings stretched wide, shadowing half the yard. "Fly," Robert commanded, gripping the improvised saddle with tense hands. Stormclaw let out another roaring shriek and launched upward in a beating of wings that nearly knocked the king off. Pain lanced through his arms and legs as he clung for dear life. The Red Keep's towers rushed by in a blur, the courtyard falling away beneath them. Wind whipped at Robert's hair, stinging his eyes. Fear and exhilaration warred in his gut. Then, with a triumphant bellow, Stormclaw soared high above King's Landing. The massive city spread below like a tapestry. The Dragon Pit ruins, the winding Blackwater rush, the sprawl of Flea Bottom. It all looked small, insignificant. And Robert laughed, deep and wild, the sound torn away by the wind. He felt unstoppable, a new conqueror. That flight set the tone for what came next. He was no longer a mere king perched on a precarious throne. He was a dragon rider, the first in over a century. Even as Stormclaw struggled to carry his broad bulk, straining to keep them aloft for long, the image of Robert astride a black-scaled beast filled King's Landing with a mixture of dread and awe. Gold cloaks patrolled the city in groups, mindful of how quickly fear could spark revolt. Yet Robert felt unstoppable. He had discovered a living terror to keep the Seven Kingdoms in line. The next step was to ensure subjugation. He summoned the great lords to King's Landing for a gathering, a forced mustering under the king's watchful eye. Many came begrudgingly, forced by the threat of the crown's new power. Mace Tyrell arrived from Highgarden with a lavish train, seeking to flatter Robert and ensure House Tyrell's continued favor. From the Vale came Yohn Royce, substituting for the infant Lord Robert Arryn. The Riverlands were represented by Edmure Tully, uncertain and resentful. The Westerlands saw Tywin Lannister arrive with half his bannermen, golden lions displayed everywhere. The Martells sent a delegation, led by Prince Doran's envoys, for the prince himself rarely traveled. Stannis Baratheon sailed in from Dragonstone, face as grim as ever. Renly came from the Stormlands, flamboyant and charming, but with caution behind his smiles. But the arrival that struck Robert most deeply was that of Eddard Stark. Ned came alone, save for a modest retinue, reflecting the North's distance and caution. On the day of his approach, Robert took to the sky with Stormclaw and circled above the King's Gate as Ned and his men entered. The Northmen had heard the rumors, but to see their old friend turned into a dragon rider was another matter entirely. Ned stared up with a look of shock and sorrow etched upon his features. Stormclaw roared once, exhaling a spout of flame that licked across the sky in a menacing show. The small folk scattered, terrified of draconic fire. Robert soared overhead, heart pounding, unsure if he felt triumph or shame. Ned had always been his moral anchor, But now, that anchor threatened to weigh him down, to remind him of the man he once was. When Robert landed in the courtyard, he dismounted roughly, stumbling slightly. Sweat drenched his face. Stormclaw hissed and spread its wings wide, casting a ripple of fear through onlookers. Ned approached, slow and deliberate. His gray eyes locked onto Robert's. They exchanged no greetings, no embraces. The king's grin faltered. At length, Ned spoke in a low voice. "What are you doing, Robert?" "What I must, old friend," Robert said, bitterness creeping into his voice. "This realm rots from within. I'll not let the Targaryens or any other threat tear it from me. I'll do what's needed to protect my throne." Ned's gaze flicked to the black dragon, its red eyes glinting with a savage hunger. "You once swore to end the Targaryen line to protect the realm from tyranny," Ned said, voice nearly a whisper. "Have you not merely replaced them in that tyranny?" Robert's temper flared, but there was shame beneath it. He forced a half-laugh. "You never did understand, Ned. This is for the good of the realm. Once the lords see my power, they'll yield. The realm will be united, strong. No more war, no more petty rebellions. I am the rightful king." Ned's face hardened, but he bowed stiffly. "As you say, your grace," he sighed, voice devoid of warmth. For a moment, Robert remembered the younger Ned, the man who had fought beside him with unflinching loyalty. Now there was a wall between them. The small folk and guards parted as Ned turned and walked away, leaving Robert to wrestle with a swirl of anger and regret. A fortnight of feasting and negotiations followed, a grand demonstration of the crown's power. Robert had Stormclaw, Jadefire, and Ghostwing displayed in a newly fortified enclosure on the eastern side of the Red Keep, near the bay, where the dragons could feed on fish and the occasional goat. The lords walked among them, marveling and trembling in turn. Many knelt quickly, reaffirming oaths, for who would dare challenge a king with dragons? Tywin Lannister maintained a cool demeanor, though Robert saw the tightness in his mouth. The West might be powerful, but dragonfire rendered gold and steel moot. Mace Tyrell fluttered about, praising the wonders of Robert's splendid beasts, as he tried to secure marriages and alliances. The Martell envoys watched with hawk-like attention, remembering the horrors Aerys Targaryen had inflicted upon their kin. Behind the scenes, Robert set demands: higher taxes, more men for his armies, unyielding loyalty. He allowed no talk of compromise. His message was clear: bend the knee or burn. Some balked, but none openly refused. The presence of 3 living dragons shattered illusions of rebellion. In that sense, Robert's plan worked. The realm would be unified, or so he believed, in the face of his unstoppable might. But beneath the surface, the seeds of discontent sprouted. The great lords were proud, and the memory of Targaryen terror was fresh in their minds. If Robert had become something akin to Aegon the Conqueror, then the lords might have to find a champion to stand against him. Whispers traveled swiftly. Some spoke of forging alliances with the rumored dragons across the sea. Word had reached Westeros that Daenerys Targaryen, too, might have dragons of her own. Others spoke of retrieving dark magic from Ashai to counter the king's new pets. Some pinned hope on the north, on Eddard Stark's sense of honor. Perhaps the Lord of Winterfell would not allow Robert to reign unchallenged. Yet Ned Stark remained silent, as uncertain as the next man. When the feasts ended, many lords departed with forced smiles and tightened brows. Robert watched them go from the ramparts, Stormclaw perched behind him in a swirl of heat. Cersei stood at his side. She slipped her arm around his, leaning her head near. "You've terrified them, my king," she purred. "At last, we'll have them kneeling as they should." Robert stared at the departing banners snapping in the breeze. He growled, "and if they do not kneel, I'll make them burn." He wondered if that was truly the man he wanted to be. But the memory of his debts, his humiliations, overshadowed such second thoughts. He was on this path now, and he would see it through. The dragons grew larger with every passing month. Stormclaw's body lengthened, wings stretching like sails. Jadefire developed a fierce cunning, often ambushing her prey in the enclosure. Ghostwing was the oddest, quiet and pale, rarely roaring but often seen gazing at the moon as though entranced. Robert's seat on the Iron Throne felt more secure by the day, but so too did the darkness in his heart, for the cost of dominion weighed heavily on him. The day that changed everything began innocently enough. The sun rose red, hazy from the distant fires that sometimes swept the Kingswood. Robert had spent a late night carousing, for old habits died hard, even with draconic power at hand. He awoke with a pounding headache, only to learn that the northern roads had erupted in violence. A band of outlaws, led by some unknown champion, had attacked crown caravans bearing taxes from the Riverlands. The rumor was that these outlaws invoked the name of Rhaegar Targaryen, a brazen challenge to the king. Robert's anger flared. How dare they? Had his might not been made plain? Without hesitation, Robert called for Stormclaw. He assembled a company of riders, and Ned Stark, who still lingered in King's Landing, was among them. Robert demanded that Ned accompany him, perhaps as a test of loyalty or an attempt to remind the North of the king's power. The troops set out on the King's Road, Stormclaw soaring overhead. On the second day's ride, they discovered the site of the ambush, a charred caravan, bodies strewn about, men and horses burnt to cinders. Yet it was not the crown's men who were burnt. They found outlaws scorched by dragonfire. The crown's caravans were nowhere to be found. Confusion reigned. Had Stormclaw ventured out on his own? Impossible. Robert kept the beast close. The fires smelled fresh. Ned dismounted, walking among the ashes, face set in grim lines. "These burn marks," he said, kneeling. "Could it be Jadefire or Ghostwing flew free of the city?" Robert scowled. "They're kept under watch. They wouldn't get past my guards." But the evidence was undeniable. Dragonfire had visited this place. Their confusion was answered an hour later when a messenger, half dead from exhaustion, arrived on a lathered horse. In broken gasps, he spoke of a monstrous black dragon swooping from the sky to attack the caravan. He claimed it was Rhaegar reborn, some phantom conjured by rebellious sorcerers. He said the crown caravans had been seized by men wearing dragon-crested helms, who spoke of restoring the rightful Targaryen line. Robert's blood boiled. Stormclaw roared, sensing his rider's fury. Ned stood silently, a storm of worry in his eyes. It seemed that Robert's ambition had unleashed more than he bargained for. Had some of the Red Priests or alchemists defected? Were there rogue factions trying to birth more dragons, to place a Targaryen pretender on the throne? The notion was unthinkable, but the burnt corpses were proof enough. Robert realized, with a pang of dread, that in conjuring dragons, he had opened a door that others could enter. The birth of Stormclaw, Jadefire, and Ghostwing might have taught the realm how to do the unthinkable. And now that knowledge was in the wild. He marched onward, determined to find these outlaws and crush them. But they moved with cunning and speed, vanishing into the forests. Stormclaw circled overhead, sniffing the wind for the scent of draconic kin, but found only emptiness. After days of fruitless searching, Robert had to return to King's Landing, angrier than ever. The presence of a renegade dragon, especially one rumored black like Stormclaw, sowed chaos. Fear gripped the crownlands. Some peasants fled their villages at the first sight of a winged shape overhead, be it Stormclaw or a mere eagle. The gold cloaks had trouble keeping order. The faith of the Seven decried the unnatural horrors that had been awakened. Into this maelstrom stepped Varys with urgent tidings. The Spider's Whisperers had found signs of a Valyrian cult operating in secret, calling itself the Scales of the Conqueror. Its goal: to restore the Targaryen line to the throne by replicating the same dark sorceries Robert had used. Robert felt a cold pit in his stomach. He realized how precarious his position truly was. He had attempted to harness forbidden power. Now that power threatened to slip from his control. In a dark council held in the Red Keep's lowest crypts, Robert met with Cersei, Varys, and the leading alchemists. They debated how to extinguish this new threat. Some urged an inquisition, rounding up all suspected sorcerers or Targaryen loyalists. Cersei demanded they crush House Targaryen's last rumored scions, Viserys and Daenerys, by sending assassins across the narrow sea. Varys cautioned that such open aggression might spark bigger conflict. Meanwhile, Stormclaw paced restlessly in the cavernous space, its wings scraping the walls, fiery breath lighting the gloom. The black beast had grown to nearly the size of a warhorse, every muscle a coiled threat. Yet for all its might, Robert knew it could not be in two places at once. If there were indeed multiple rogue dragons in Westeros, Robert's advantage was no longer absolute. At last, Robert decided on swift and brutal action. He would not let the seeds of rebellion grow. He dispatched ravens to every corner of the Seven Kingdoms, commanding that any sign of dragon worship, Valyrian cults, or Targaryen sympathizers be reported immediately. He sent the Kingsguard to root out traitors in the Crownlands. He ordered Jadefire and Ghostwing harnessed, putting them under the command of trusted knights, though none dared attempt to fly them just yet. The city readied for war. The forges worked night and day, forging new spears and crossbow bolts with barbed tips, in case the city watch or the army needed to face dragons in combat. The madness of it unsettled many. Was King's Landing to become the cradle of a second dance of dragons? Ned Stark, quiet for too long, confronted Robert in the throne room. "You must see where this leads," he said, voice hoarse. "You're turning the realm into a battlefield of fire and blood. The small folk suffer, the lords fear you. This path, there is no salvation in it." Robert glowered from the Iron Throne. He was clad in black now, with gilded dragon-scale motifs. Stormclaw coiled near the dais, tail twitching like an angry cat's. "I have no choice. If I show weakness, they'll rise against me. I must crush them now, or they'll tear the realm apart." Ned pointed an accusing finger at the dragon. "You brought this doom upon us. Did you never think such power might inspire others to do the same?" Robert laughed, though there was no mirth in it. "If they think to match my might, let them come. My hammer crushed Rhaegar. My dragons will crush any pretender." Ned's face fell, the lines of sorrow deepening. "Then we are lost." He bowed curtly. "I pray the gods have mercy on us, your grace." With that, he turned and departed, footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. Robert's breath came fast. He found he wanted to call out to Ned, to stop him, to assure him this was all for the good of the realm. But pride and anger held his tongue. So he sat there, a heavy-set king on a throne of swords, a black dragon at his feet, listening to the pounding of his own heart. Days later, the news arrived. A great black dragon had been spotted in the skies near Harrenhal, spitting flame at travelers on the roads below. Banners of unknown origin accompanied it. The black fortress of Harrenhal, once melted by Balerian's fire in ages past, stood once more at the center of a dragon's wrath. The irony was bitter. Robert rose from his seat with a grimace. He would ride out personally with Stormclaw to face this threat. If a second black dragon truly soared, he would challenge it in the sky. He would be the only dragon rider in Westeros, or none at all. Cersei demanded to accompany him, but Robert refused. He commanded that Jadefire and Ghostwing remain to protect King's Landing. "If this is a trap, I won't risk all our dragons," he said. The Queen's green eyes blazed, but she relented. Before Robert departed, she seized his hand. "Burn them all," she hissed softly. "Let them know who wields the real power." Robert set forth with 1,000 men, gold cloaks and knights, but the heart of his force was Stormclaw. The black dragon flew overhead, a symbol of dread. The king traveled quickly along the King's Road, pushing his men hard. Along the way, the peasants hid behind their shutters, glancing up in terror as Stormclaw's shadow flickered across their fields. Some threw themselves prostrate in the mud, calling Robert the Black Dragon King. He ignored them, forging on with grim determination. Ned was not with him. He had left King's Landing quietly. Robert chose not to question where he had gone. Within a week, the towers of Harrenhal loomed on the horizon, twisted spires that once had been melted into grotesque shapes by the flames of Aegon's dragon. Smoke drifted across the battlements, tinted red by the setting sun. Robert spurred his horse forward, Stormclaw descending to land heavily in a nearby clearing with a roar that sent flocks of crows scattering. His advanced scouts returned with a report. Harrenhal was held by a renegade company, rumored to be in service to House Targaryen. More troubling, they claimed to have glimpsed a black dragon perched on the highest rampart. Robert felt his heart thunder. If this was real, then the fabled second black dragon was indeed here. He left half his men to encircle the fortress, while he advanced with the others under the cover of night, Stormclaw stalking behind them like a great hunting cat. The fortress's gate stood open, a taunt or perhaps a trap. They advanced into the cursed castle's courtyard, the moonlight revealing melted towers and labyrinthine passages. The silence was eerie. Then, from the top of a broken tower, came the roar, deeper and louder than Stormclaw's. A massive shape unfurled in the moonlit sky. Flames streaked downward, scattering Robert's men. Stormclaw answered with a thunderous shriek, rearing onto his hind legs. Robert, heart pounding, scrambled onto the dragon's saddle. He barely had time to fasten the straps before Stormclaw launched upward, meeting the other beast in a collision of fangs and talons. A maelstrom of black wings and fire enveloped the sky above Harrenhal. Robert clung for dear life, buffeted by the force of the dragon's battle. The second dragon was larger than Stormclaw by half a head, with molten eyes and a roar like grinding stone. The two beasts grappled mid-air, flames spitting from their jaws, illuminating the fortress in hellish light. Men below cried out, some fleeing, some cheering. Robert's vision blurred with the dizzying swirl of moonlit towers. He felt the heat of the other dragon's breath, smelled the stench of scorched leather as Stormclaw was raked by a slash of claws. Yet Stormclaw was savage, forged by the darkest sorceries of the Red Keep. He twisted free of the other dragon's grip, unleashing a jet of flame that seared across the enemy's flank. Roaring in pain, the renegade dragon swiped back. The impact nearly knocked Robert from the saddle. The sky spun. For a moment, he dangled by one hand, mind reeling with terror. Then he hauled himself back, gripping his warhammer in the other, though what use was a hammer in a clash of dragons? They soared past a half-collapsed turret. Below, in the courtyard, Robert glimpsed armed figures wearing black armor with the three-headed dragon of Targaryen on their chests. So the traitors truly were Targaryen loyalists or pretenders. Robert cursed them all. He would burn them to ash. A roar tore his attention back to the airborne melee. The other dragon flew in a wide arc, then dove at Stormclaw's side. The collision rattled Robert's bones. A torrent of flame engulfed them both. Stormclaw screeched, driven downward by the force. They plummeted, smashing through the upper rampart of a tower, sending rubble cascading below. Robert tasted blood in his mouth, the heat of the flames searing his face. The dragons spiraled toward the courtyard. Just before they hit the ground, Stormclaw twisted, snapping at the other beast's neck. The renegade dragon bellowed in agony. They crashed in a thunderous impact that shook the castle walls, sending men tumbling. Dust and debris choked the air. Robert coughed, half-blinded, but he felt Stormclaw still moving beneath him. The other dragon lay pinned, writhing, a great shard of broken masonry lodged through its side. Stormclaw reared back, exhaled a final blast of flame that consumed the renegade's head in a blazing inferno. The smell of burning flesh was horrific. The pinned dragon let loose a last, keening wail, then collapsed, flames dancing across its scales. Stormclaw roared triumph, echoing across the night, announcing that he was the ultimate predator. Robert slid to the ground, battered and dazed, but alive. Soldiers rushed in, torches held high. The renegade dragons remained smoldered in a crackling pyre. Yet in the glare of the fire, Robert saw a figure approach. A tall man clad in old Targaryen plate, blackened from the flames. He removed his helm, revealing a face twisted with hatred, half-burned by the inferno. Robert recognized him as no Targaryen but one of the lesser Stormlord knights who had once served House Baratheon. He spat at Robert's feet. "You think you are a conqueror?" The man growled, voice ragged. "You are the usurper still. You played with Targaryen fire, and now it spreads. Others will rise. The realm will drown in dragon's flame." Robert stared at him with raw fury. "I am the king," he snarled. "I will not be challenged." The man's laughter rang hollow. "We have eggs hidden across the 7 kingdoms. We have acolytes who can hatch them. This is only the beginning, Robert Baratheon. You have unleashed powers you cannot contain." Then, with a snarl, the knight lunged, blade raised. Robert bellowed and swung his warhammer. The blow crushed the man's chest, sending him sprawling dead in the dirt. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by Stormclaw's heavy breathing. Torches flickered on the bloodied courtyard. Harrenhal's melted towers loomed overhead, silent witnesses to the dawn of a new, savage age. Robert exhaled, chest burning. His men looked to him, expecting an exultant cry, but he felt only dread. He had triumphed in this battle, but the man's words lingered in his mind. The realm would drown in dragon's flame. He turned to Stormclaw, who panted with ragged breaths, black scales scorched and torn. The beast's red eyes flickered toward Robert. In the glow of the torches, king and dragon regarded one another, bound by the violence of the moment. Then Robert raised his hammer high and roared for the realm to hear, as if volume alone could banish the doubts gnawing at his heart. The echoes of that roar carried beyond Harrenhal's walls, out into the night, heralding the savage times to come. For Robert Baratheon had indeed revived Aegon's conquest in his own fashion, and Westeros would never be the same. Yet even in victory, the king felt the weight of dragon's wings folding around him like a portent of doom. He had seized upon forbidden magic, thinking it would strengthen his crown, but in doing so, he had unleashed something far older and wilder than he could control. The blackened towers of Harrenhal, once melted by Aegon's fires, now stood as witnesses to Robert's gamble. Triumph glimmered in the flames, but so did the promise of endless strife. For dragons, once reborn, would not easily be corralled by mortal ambition, and the 7 kingdoms trembled beneath the thrashing of their wings. Robert stood amid the broken courtyard of Harrenhal, haunted by the dying echoes of his own roar. The taste of ash and blood lay thick in his mouth. Stormclaw loomed beside him, nostrils flaring with each labored breath, black scales gleaming with the sticky residue of gore. The carcass of the renegade dragon still smoldered, a wavering haze rising from the scorched remains. Light from the torches played across the melted towers of that once proud fortress, highlighting the sins of the past. And as Robert stared into the darkness, he realized how fully his kingdom now lay in the grip of the terror he had unleashed. He did not speak for a time, nor did his men. The dust of the collapsed rampart still swirled in the air, stinging eyes and throats. At length, one of the knights found the courage to approach and knelt by Robert's side. "Your Grace," he said, voice wary, "shall we press on into the keep? There may be more of these traitors within." Robert felt an urge to crush something, to hammer it into the ground until it stopped breathing. The renegade knight's final words still rang in his ears. "We have eggs hidden across the 7 kingdoms. We have acolytes who can hatch them. This is only the beginning." Robert had done more than dethrone the Targaryens. He had dethroned reason itself. And now the realm's future seemed set to devour itself in dragonfire. He forced himself to square his shoulders. A king must show no weakness. "Search every corridor," he ordered, voice rough. "Take prisoners where you can. If any man fights, burn him out. Harrenhal belongs to the crown." The courtyard stirred with activity. His gold cloaks and sworn swords fanned out, stepping through rubble and collapsed archways, weapons drawn. Stormclaw hissed and lowered its head, bright red eyes flitting among the trembling men. Most gave the beast a wide berth, but despite Stormclaw's victory, the creature bore wounds. Claw marks streaked its flanks, and trails of smoking ichor clung to its battered hide. Robert laid a hand on the dragon's side, feeling the quiver of living muscle, the intense heat that emanated from within. Stormclaw snarled softly, neither friendly nor hostile. In that moment, Robert wondered if the beast sensed his own turmoil, if it knew the uncertainty in his heart. He took a heavy breath, coughed on the dust, then left Stormclaw in the courtyard to watch over the main gate. He stomped through Harrenhal's inner yard, stepping over twisted fragments of fallen stone. The fortress had been left half-ruined since Aegon's day, but its labyrinthine corridors remained a place of nightmares and secrets. Light from flickering torches revealed battered doors, dank passageways, echoes of old horrors. His men pressed on, searching for any sign of the Valyrian cult that had claimed this place. They found them scattered about in smaller pockets. Some were mere servants who wore the three-headed dragon sigil. They knelt quickly, crying for mercy. Others, bolder, rushed out of hidden alcoves with swords in hand, shouting Targaryen war cries. Robert's knights cut them down with grim efficiency. The thick smell of blood filled the corridors. In one twisting hallway, Robert came upon a locked chamber. When they battered down the door, they found half a dozen black-robed figures hunched over a table covered in old Valyrian scrolls. The robed men reached for crude daggers, chanting something that sounded like an invocation to the old gods of Valyria. Robert snarled and moved faster. He swung his warhammer in a brutal arc, spattering the stone walls with gore. The chanting ceased in a wet gargle. His knights dragged the survivors to their feet. Within that chamber, Robert found a scattering of bizarre relics. Old dragon bones, chunks of obsidian, half-burned candles that dripped with scented wax. There was a small brazier set with coals, apparently used in attempts at conjuring. One robed captive, a gaunt, hollow-cheeked man with furious eyes, refused to speak even when Robert demanded answers. One of the gold cloaks backhanded him, sending him spinning against the wall. Blood dribbled from his nose. Still, he glared in defiance, refusing to kneel. Robert grabbed him by the collar. "Where are the eggs?" he growled. "Where is your master?" His face was so close that he could smell the prisoner's sour breath. The gaunt man spat. "We serve the true blood of the dragon," he rasped. "Not the usurper who defiles the old ways." His eyes flicked with a hatred that was almost fanatical. "Your black beast will not save you from the conflagration to come." Robert's patience frayed. He slammed the man against the table. "You fools," he snarled. "You would set this realm ablaze, all for the sake of a dead dynasty? Do you even understand what you're doing?" The prisoner only cackled, a mad sound echoing off the walls. "Do you?" he managed. "We are the heirs of Valyria, even if we wear mortal faces. You have opened the path, Robert Baratheon. Pried open a door that has been sealed for centuries." His lips drew back. "Now it will not be closed." Robert's hammer came down almost before he registered his own anger. The blow crushed the table's edge, splintering wood. The captive lurched to the side, half his bones shattered. Silence descended, broken only by a strangled wheeze. Robert stood over him, chest heaving. Torches flickered, revealing the king's face twisted in fury. He left the man to die on the stones and stormed back into the corridor, mind seething. He told himself that he had no choice. Treason was treason, black magic was black magic. They had forced his hand. Yet as he stalked deeper into Harrenhal, as he smashed each rebellious pocket of Targaryen loyalists, he felt a mounting dread that he was merely hacking at the branches of a diseased tree whose roots reached far deeper than he could know. Again and again, those final words of the renegade knight echoed in his mind. "We have eggs hidden across the 7 kingdoms." That thought was the worst. He remembered Stormclaw's hatching, the swirl of ritual and wildfire, the chanting in Valyrian. He recalled the precarious hush in the chamber when the shell first cracked. If other eggs were scattered about, then others could be hatched. More dragons would take wing. And then what? Another war like the Dance of the Dragons, but bloodier still, with magic fueling an endless cycle of vengeance? He pushed the vision aside. He was the king. He had wrested the crown from madness once before. He would do it again, even if it meant burning out every last cultist, every last rumored egg. Even if it meant matching the Targaryens in cruelty. By dawn, Harrenhal was subdued. Smoke clung to the battlements, a funeral haze. Robert's men rounded up a handful of captives. Stormclaw dozed fitfully in the courtyard, occasionally raising its head to snarl at passers-by. The beast's injuries would need tending by the alchemists who specialized in dragon care. Robert had discovered, in the last many moons, that such knowledge had never truly vanished. Grim-faced and spattered in blood, the king surveyed the results of his conquest. Few of the cultists had survived. Bodies littered the corridors. Another page of horror in Harrenhal's cursed history. The final prisoner of note was brought before him in the courtyard. A wiry woman clad in scorched leather, her left arm hanging limp from a savage burn. She was forced to her knees by 2 knights. Her expression was hollow, streaked with soot, but she looked Robert in the eye without flinching. "Your Grace," said Ser Talbot, one of Robert's sworn swords. "We found her near the rookery. She bears the Targaryen sigil, but she claims to have news you must hear." Robert crossed his arms over his chest. "Speak," he commanded. The woman swallowed, sweat beading on her grime-streaked brow. "You will find no more eggs here," she said, voice cracking. "This fortress was merely a waypoint, a place to hatch the beast you slew. The eggs we had were spent except that one. But there are other places." "Where?" Robert demanded. "You will name them, or you will die screaming." He nodded to his knights, who twisted the woman's arms, drawing a gasp of pain from her lips. "They are scattered," she answered through gritted teeth. "Some to the north, some to the Vale, some to the islands. Old places, hidden passages, lost vaults. You might find 1 egg or half a dozen. It scarcely matters. You cannot stop it now." Robert glared. "Why do you speak so freely?" A grim smirk tugged at her mouth. "Because the day is lost for my companions here. The dragon you slew was to be a rallying cry. Without it, this cell of resistance is finished." She sucked in a ragged breath. "But you will never find all the others. How can you thwart conspirators you cannot see? The seeds have been planted, and they will sprout in blood." Robert felt a violent urge to strike her, but the memory of the earlier prisoner's mad laughter burned fresh. Another prophecy of doom, the same dark promise repeated. The realm would drown in dragon's flame. He flexed his fists, then gestured for the knights to bind her. "Take her back to King's Landing," he ordered. "Let the dungeons have her. Perhaps she'll sing more sweetly to the questioners." He turned away, refusing to dignify her further with his attention. Before day's end, he organized a garrison to hold Harrenhal, placing the castle in the hands of a loyal crown official. Though the fortress was half ruined, it was still strategic ground in the heart of the Riverlands. Robert wanted a permanent presence here to monitor any renewed stirrings of rebellion. He also ordered a thorough search of every inch of the fortress, scouring the undercrofts, the vaults, the stables, for any sign of hidden eggs or sorcerous tomes. They found only charred remains and worthless scraps of parchment. Evidently, the cultists had hidden their true knowledge elsewhere. When Robert mounted Stormclaw for the journey back, the dragon rumbled with pain but unfurled its wings. Men below scattered. Stormclaw's scorched hide looked ghastly in daylight, the black scales dull where the other dragon's claws had left gouges. Robert felt no triumph in flight that day. The countryside unrolled beneath him, lush forests and winding rivers, yet he saw only how vulnerable it all was. A single rogue dragon could devastate a swath of farmland. If more arose, if multiple factions acquired them, Westeros would become a living hell. He forced his mind to more immediate matters. He would return to King's Landing, consult with Varys, with Pycelle, with the alchemists. He would unleash a wave of hunts, an unrelenting inquisition to root out these hidden cells of Valyrian fanaticism. If some eggs existed, he would see them found and destroyed. He told himself it was a righteous duty, that it would spare the realm from chaos. Yet another part of him, quieter and more uneasy, wondered if he was simply following in Aerys' footsteps. Burn them all, as the Mad King had once screeched. He soared over farmland, Stormclaw's labored wing beats rattling the air. Now and then the dragon let out a pained hiss. Even from the saddle, Robert could see that Stormclaw's left wing membrane had tears. The old knights had once told tales of how dragons could heal from wounds that would kill lesser beasts, but it would require time and care. Stormclaw might be grounded for weeks. That realization sank like a stone in Robert's stomach. His greatest weapon, battered and bruised. If an enemy struck now, King's Landing would be forced to rely on Jadefire and Ghostwing, neither yet grown large enough to match Stormclaw's fearsome might. The flight was shorter than the ride would have been, but it still took a toll. By the time the towers of the Red Keep came into view, Stormclaw's breath came in ragged gasps. Robert guided the wounded dragon down into the courtyard that had been converted into a draconic enclosure. Servants scattered in terror at the unexpected arrival from above. Stormclaw landed awkwardly, nearly collapsing onto one flank. Robert leapt off the saddle and bellowed for the alchemists. Flames flickered in the dragon's throat, but it did not spew them. The creature merely groaned and folded its wings, sides heaving. Cersei appeared on the ramparts, flanked by Lannister guards and a few members of the Kingsguard. She strode down the steps, expression tight, eyes flashing with a mixture of alarm and anger. Robert did not speak until she was near enough to hear his low mutter. "He's wounded," Robert said, running a hand over the dragon's battered flank. "We slew the traitor's beast, but Stormclaw paid for it in blood." Cersei frowned at the scorched hide. "And Harrenhal?" she asked. "Is it ours again?" "It is," Robert replied wearily. "The rebellion there is crushed. For now." Something in the way he said those words made Cersei's eyes narrow. "You speak as though you expect another. Is there something you haven't told me?" Robert jerked his head at the alchemists who came rushing forward with jars of salves. "You," he barked, "be careful. See to it his wounds do not fester." Stormclaw snarled when they approached. The king laid a hand on the beast's head, exerting his presence to keep it calm. He felt the trembling tension beneath the scales. At length he turned to Cersei, lowering his voice. "They had another dragon, black as midnight, larger than Stormclaw. We destroyed it, but they claim to have scattered more eggs across the realm. They're breeding rebellion like rats." The queen's lips thinned into a harsh line. "Then we hunt them like rats. Have Varys sniff out every pocket of treachery. Tell Littlefinger to provide the coin for an inquisition. The faith will be our ally in this. The High Septon has no love for black magic. We stamp it out root and stem." Robert nodded, though a part of him chafed at the idea of the faith meddling in his realm. He disliked religious fanatics nearly as much as he disliked sorcerers. But in these circumstances, perhaps the Seven could be used as a bulwark against Valyrian cults. "Very well," he rumbled. "I'll see it done." Cersei's gaze drifted to the other side of the enclosure, where Jadefire and Ghostwing lay dozing. The green female stirred at Stormclaw's arrival, raising her scaled head in curiosity. Ghostwing remained curled in an eerie stillness, pale wings folded tight. Even from a distance, the hush around Ghostwing felt unsettling, as if the air itself bent away from him. "We still have two more," Cersei pointed out. "Let the traitors hatch a few scrawny dragons of their own. We have the might of the crown." Robert grunted. "I'm not eager for a war of dragons. You saw how Stormclaw fared, and that's only one beast. The rumors say there might be more." He clenched his fists, feeling the old wariness that had once guided him to victory over Rhaegar. Any new dragon is a threat, no matter how small. Cersei studied him for a moment, then laid a hand on his arm. "Then we'll destroy them. We are Baratheons of the Stormlands and Lannisters of the Rock. We do not bow to conjurers and illusions." Robert exhaled, some tension leaving his shoulders, though not all. "I need food and rest," he muttered, stepping away. "We'll have council in an hour. Gather every advisor I still trust." He left Stormclaw's care to the alchemists, accompanied by a handful of red priests who hovered at the edges, offering incantations to Lawler. Robert hated the notion of foreign priests chanting over his dragon, but they had proven useful in Stormclaw's hatching, so perhaps they could help him heal faster. Even so, the entire courtyard felt drenched in an air of black sorcery, tinged with the ghosts of Targaryens long dead. Robert took a quick meal of ale and roasted meat in his solar, ignoring the stench of his own sweat and the crust of dried blood on his skin. He had no patience for a proper bath or rest. Cersei joined him briefly, but she said little, content to watch him eat with narrowed eyes. Then she departed, presumably to prepare for the coming council. She left behind only the faint perfume of lilies and a swirl of gold hair. Robert found he had no appetite after that. He set the food aside, drained the ale, and trudged to the council chamber. He arrived to find Varys already present, seemingly at ease, though the master of whisperers wore an expression of watchful concern. Pycelle lingered at the far side of the table, stooped with age, his white whiskers quivering. Cersei entered next, regal in black and gold, flanked by 2 Lannister guards. Littlefinger arrived last, wearing a sardonic half-smile that vanished as soon as he glanced at Robert's glowering face. Robert seated himself at the head of the table, ignoring the dull ache in his limbs. The others took their places. Beyond the tall windows, King's Landing lay in a haze of midday heat, the bustle of the city flowing on as though the realm were not on the brink of an abyss. For a moment, Robert let the mundane sights anchor him. Then he cleared his throat. "We have new threats," he growled. "I faced a second black dragon at Harrenhal, hatched by cultists who claim loyalty to House Targaryen. I destroyed it, but they insist there are more eggs hidden across Westeros. They seek to raise an army of dragons to challenge my rule." A ripple of unease passed over the council. Pycelle's brows shot up, Varys steepled his fingers, and Littlefinger made a soft, thoughtful sound. Cersei folded her arms, tight-lipped. Robert continued, "Word will spread quickly. If any lords harbor resentment or Targaryen sympathies, they may be tempted by the promise of dragons. We must ensure that does not happen." He glanced at Varys. "I want your whisperers on this. Find every rumor of eggs, every scrap of gossip about Valyrian rights. We stamp them out before they breed fresh abominations." Varys gave a small bow. "Your Grace, I have eyes in many places. I shall direct them to focus on any mention of hidden clutches or strange gatherings. However, such secrets are notoriously elusive." Littlefinger interjected, "Perhaps we can offer rewards for information on Targaryen loyalists. Gold speaks louder than fear. As Master of Coin, I can arrange a bounty system. Any who provide credible evidence of hidden eggs or cultist activities will be rewarded handsomely." Robert nodded curtly. "Do it. Drain the crown's coffers if you must. We cannot allow these traitors to fester. Pycelle, you will consult the Citadel. Demand they send what knowledge they can gather about dragon eggs, ancient Targaryen holdings, anything that might point us to a cache." The old maester coughed, wringing his hands. "Yes, Your Grace, though I fear much knowledge was lost or hidden over the centuries. Many Targaryen secrets vanished when the old regime fell." He eyed Robert warily. "Still, I shall do my utmost." "See that you do," Robert growled. He turned to Cersei. "Send word to the High Septon. Let him preach that dabbling in Valyrian sorcery is blasphemy against the Seven. We'll harness faith to our cause. Any man discovered practicing these rites shall be branded a heretic." Cersei inclined her head. "It will be done, my king." A hush fell, charged with tension. Robert loomed at the table's end, fists clenched. "We must also consider our own defenses. Stormclaw is wounded. Jadefire and Ghostwing are growing, but they aren't yet the match of a fully grown dragon. If the rebels manage to hatch one, we must be prepared for that possibility. The City Watch, the Royal Army, all must be readied." "Of course," said Littlefinger, "but soldiers and crossbows alone may not suffice against dragons." Robert's gaze flickered toward the window, where a tinge of smoke from the city's chimneys stained the midday sky. He remembered the green flame of wildfire that had once threatened to destroy King's Landing, courtesy of the Mad King. A repulsive memory, yet a possibility. "The alchemists have their wildfire," he said. "I loathe to use it, but if we must, we will. Our city will not fall to these cultists." Varys gave a polite nod. I believe the Alchemists' Guild will be eager to prove their worth, Your Grace. Cersei's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Then we have our plan. Robert dismissed them with a curt wave. He felt unsteady, as though the floor rocked beneath him like the deck of a ship in rough water. Once they had gone, he sat alone in the chamber, staring at the carved sigils adorning the walls, each representing a noble house of Westeros. He traced the stag banner in his mind, remembering how proud he had once been to overthrow the Targaryens. Now, ironically, he was forced to adopt their greatest power to hold the realm together. And in that adoption, he had paved the way for new terrors to arise. Damn it all, he muttered under his breath. Then, summoning what remained of his will, he rose and left to see to Stormclaw's injuries. The alchemists had set up a makeshift infirmary in the dragon enclosure, with braziers burning aromatic herbs meant to calm an agitated beast. The air reeked of sulfur and scorching metal. Stormclaw lay curled on a bed of heated sand, sides rising and falling slowly. A group of robed attendants scurried around, applying ointments made from obscure extracts. One carefully stitched the largest tears in the wing membrane. Robert approached, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The alchemists bowed hastily. Stormclaw opened one great red eye and regarded Robert with a rumbling note in its throat. "How fares he?" the king asked. One of the alchemists, an older man with sallow cheeks, replied in a quavering voice. "He's stable, Your Grace. The wounds are extensive but not mortal. Dragons possess remarkable vitality. With proper care, he should fly again in due time." Robert grunted and knelt by Stormclaw's head. The heat radiating from the dragon's scales was intense, akin to standing beside a forge. He placed a hand on the leathery snout, feeling the rumble that vibrated beneath his palm. "You're a tough bastard," Robert said quietly, half to himself. "Heal well, Stormclaw. We still have foes to burn." The dragon blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. Robert wondered if the creature sensed the tension in his words, the swirl of fear and determination in his heart. Or perhaps it only smelled the lingering blood on his clothes. He stayed there for a long moment, letting the hush of the enclosure settle around him, until at last he rose and withdrew to the Red Keep's inner passages. He was so exhausted that he stumbled on the steps, nearly crashing into a passing servant. The day's horrors pressed on him from all sides, but a king had no right to rest. Not now. There were ravens to send, messages to dispatch, the next wave of hunts to plan. The seeds of anarchy had been planted, and Robert would not allow them to grow. He took a few hours to change his clothes, scrubbing off the grime of battle. By the time he next appeared in the throne room, wearing polished boots and black and gold raiment, the lords and courtiers who saw him might have thought nothing was amiss, were it not for the expression of grim resolve carved into his face. He summoned the city watch captains, ordering them to redouble patrols and search out suspicious gatherings. He charged the Kingsguard with heightened vigilance around the Red Keep, warning that conspirators might strike at the heart of the crown. Every measure smelled of fear, but Robert tried to mask it in bravado. When the common folk glimpsed him passing, they bowed hastily, some crossing themselves in silent prayer. The king with dragons, it was whispered, had returned from Harrenhal in a fury. Late that evening, a knock sounded upon the door of his private solar. Robert, half sunk into a chair with a goblet of wine in hand, grunted permission to enter. The door swung open to reveal Eddard Stark. Robert straightened, setting the goblet aside. He had almost forgotten that Ned was still in the city, quiet as a shadow. There had been no word of him for days. Ned's face was sober, his gray eyes flicking over Robert's features. The two men stared at each other for a tense moment. "Come in," Robert said at last. Ned stepped inside and shut the door. He wore plain riding leathers, dusted with travel. It seemed he had returned from some journey. Without waiting for an invitation, he took a seat opposite Robert. They sat in silence, the flicker of candlelight revealing the lines of strain in both men's faces. Finally, Ned spoke. "I went north of the city to see if the rumors were true. A second dragon soared near Harrenhal. His voice was hushed, tinged with weariness. Word travels fast, even if the realm still tries to piece the full story together. Robert gave a short nod. Aye, it was true. I slew it with Stormclaw, but not before it nearly gutted him. Cultists of House Targaryen, or at least Targaryen sympathizers. They hatched the beast, and they have more eggs hidden. Ned's brow furrowed. So it begins. I told you, Robert. This would breed only further madness. He paused, as if weighing his words. Have you considered stepping back from these experiments? Destroying your own eggs? Releasing the dragons from your service? Perhaps we can end this spiral if we show the realm that we renounce such sorcery. At that, Robert felt his anger surge, though tempered by the exhaustion that pressed upon him. Release Stormclaw and Jadefire and Ghostwing? Would you have me throw away the only advantage I have? These traitors will not rest until they see me dead and a Targaryen restored. Ned looked pained. There was a time you believed in justice and in the old ways of loyalty. Now you find yourself amidst alchemists, red priests, and these monstrous beasts. I do not say it lightly, but you are forging a path not unlike the Targaryens of old. Fire and blood, Robert. Is that truly what we need to keep the realm united? Robert smacked his palm against the arm of his chair. And how else would you have me rule? Shall I cower while every petty lord sharpens a dagger for my back? We saw how well reason worked with the Mad King. He glared, then softened his tone, remembering that once Ned was the brother he chose for himself. I have to do this, Ned. I didn't ask for these conspiracies to arise. I never asked for these dragons, truly. But I cannot deny that they give me power I need to hold the realm. And if that means I must wrestle with curses, so be it. Ned's shoulders sagged. I see you are set on this course. Then I ask you to think carefully. The more you lean on Dragonfire, the more of these cults will sprout to challenge you, and the more destruction you will sow in response. It ends only one way, with the realm in flames. Robert took up his goblet and drank deeply, letting the wine wash away the bitter taste in his mouth. Then I must be the last man standing when the flames burn out. No more, no less. He ran a hand through his graying hair. Why did you come, Ned? Just to lecture me? A faint trace of emotion crossed Ned's features. Grief, perhaps. I came to say farewell. I will not remain in King's Landing to watch the realm descend into another dance of dragons. My duty is to the north, to Winterfell. I'll keep the north loyal for as long as I can, but I will not be part of this madness. Spare me from your hunts, your inquisitions. If you demand me to bow, I will bow. But do not ask me to burn the small folk at the stake under suspicion of harboring eggs. Robert felt something knot in his chest. The last remnants of the old friendship lay between them, stretched taut. I never wanted this breach between us. Ned rose, his face bleak. Nor did I. We fought side by side for a cause we believed just. Now I barely recognized the man I called friend. He paused, looking at Robert with the faintest flicker of pity. I pray, for the sake of the realm, that the dragons do not consume you. With that, Ned turned and left, boots echoing on the stone floor. Robert sat motionless, anger and regret warring inside him. He wanted to shout after Ned, to demand that he remain, that he speak reason into Robert's ear, as he had done so many times before. But he knew the words would ring hollow. Ned's sense of honor had already been wounded beyond repair by the sight of dragons under Baratheon rule. Robert could not undo that choice now. He drained the rest of the wine, but it did little to ease his thoughts. The realm was fracturing beneath his feet. Where once lords had pledged themselves wholeheartedly to House Baratheon, out of respect for Robert's deeds on the Trident, or out of fear of his warhammer, now they whispered of Targaryen restorations and brandished newly hatched horrors in the night sky. He thought of the dream that had struck him when he first touched Balerian's skull in the Red Keep's depths. A single spark had ignited in his mind, leading him down this path. Now that spark had become an inferno. He set the goblet aside and closed his eyes, if only for a moment, wishing sleep could bring him the surcease that wakefulness denied. But sleep held no solace. Whenever he dozed in the small hours, he saw visions of black wings blotting out the sun, of cities aflame, of empty sockets where dragon eyes once burned. He dreamed of Rhaegar Targaryen's face twisted in a triumphant sneer, though Robert had killed him decades past. In the dream, Rhaegar said, "You have done my work for me, Robert. You have brought the dragons back." And Robert, in that dream, could only roar in helpless fury as the flames devoured the Seven Kingdoms. He woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding like a war drum. The next weeks brought the realm into a feverish state of vigilance. Ravens flew out from King's Landing in droves, carrying proclamations from the Iron Throne. Any man, woman, or child who possessed knowledge of a Targaryen egg must surrender it or face dire consequences. The crown offered gold for verifiable leads, and threatened imprisonment or execution for any who sheltered the cultists. Word spread quickly, fueling an uneasy hush in towns and castles alike. The High Septon, coaxed by the crown's gold and authority, preached with zealous fervor. "Those who cavort with dragons dance with devils. Turn them in, and the Seven shall bless your fields." Across the Reach, the Riverlands, and the Crownlands, local septons took up the cry, urging the small folk to report suspicious gatherings. In some places, unruly mobs formed, attacking hedge wizards and traveling performers on the mere suspicion of witchcraft. The faith militant, though disbanded in the past, began to re-emerge in small cells of armed devotees who pledged to hunt out heresy. Robert allowed it all, seeing it as a necessary evil to flush out the real threats. Yet for every whisper that led to a group of genuine conspirators, half a dozen proved to be false or the result of petty feuds. Neighbors accused neighbors to settle old grudges. Innocent families were dragged from their homes by the city watch or local lords paranoid about dragons. Fear ran rampant. Despite Robert's grand show of power, rumors kept swirling that somewhere in the mountains of the Vale, a red-scaled drake had been hatched, that in the ruins of Summerhall, a golden egg lay waiting to be quickened, that in the depths of the ocean near Pike, iron-born priests were performing rites to birth a sea dragon. Absurd stories, but each one sparked new waves of hysteria. Meanwhile, King's Landing itself grew tense and crowded. Farmers and villagers, spooked by the talk of dragons prowling the countryside, flocked to the city seeking protection. Robert's tax collectors, emboldened by the promise of extra men, forced coin from reluctant small folk. Tensions flared in Flea Bottom, where bread grew scarce and the cost of living soared. Street brawls became frequent, the gold cloaks struggling to maintain order. More than once, Robert had to dispatch Jadefire or Ghostwing overhead, circling in a brief show of draconic might to quell the worst riots. Jadefire, the green-scaled female, had grown to the size of a stout horse, cunning and lithe. She seemed to relish the skies, swooping low to scatter crowds when commanded. Her temperament was sly but vicious if provoked. Ghostwing, pale as a wisp, was quieter, more mysterious, but no less dangerous. He rarely roared, rarely showed aggression, yet the half-glimpsed illusions of shimmering air around him made men uneasy. Stories spread that if one stared too long into Ghostwing's eyes, one might see fleeting apparitions of the doom of Valyria. Superstition, perhaps, but enough to keep the population wary. Stormclaw, meanwhile, recovered slowly. His wing began to knit, but the once proud beast was subdued. Robert felt a pang of unease every time he visited the enclosure and saw Stormclaw lying there, occasionally stretching his injured wing with a hiss of pain. Robert demanded the alchemists work miracles to hasten the healing, but the old knowledge of dragons had decayed through centuries of disuse. They tried potions, salves, even incantations from red priests. Progress was slow. Thus, the realm's most formidable dragon stayed grounded, an ailing king in his own domain. In the midst of this turmoil, visitors poured into King's Landing with demands, complaints, or petitions. One morning, while Robert sat heavily on the Iron Throne, half listening to the bleating of lesser lords, a herald announced the arrival of Brian Mouton, Lord of Maidenpool. The man entered the throne room with hurried steps, looking pale beneath his traveling cloak. "Your Grace," he said with a bow, "I bring word of a disturbance in the hills near Duskendale. Some claim to have seen a creature breathing fire by night. My men found scorch marks along the grass, and a few shepherds claim their flocks were roasted. We suspect another dragon." A hush fell. The courtiers exchanged alarmed glances. Robert's gauntlet hand tightened on the arm of the Iron Throne. "Another one? Did your men see it clearly?" Lord Mouton shook his head. "No, your grace. Only glimpses of something black and winged, or so they claimed. But the smell of burnt flesh was real enough." Grim lines hardened in Robert's face. "Send a raven to the crown whenever you have more information. Meanwhile, bolster your patrols. If you find any sign of a Targaryen cult, crush them." Mouton looked uncertain. "Shall we request a dragon from the crown to assist?" At that, Robert let out a short laugh, devoid of humor. "Our dragons are otherwise engaged. You will have to do your duty with steel and cunning." He waved a dismissive hand. "Go!" As Mouton departed, Robert felt the familiar churn of dread in his gut. Another dragon. Perhaps it was no more than a rumor, a trick of the shadows in a land beset by dragon fever. But perhaps not. He pictured a newborn hatchling skulking through the hills, grown enough to roast a few sheep. The realm was too vast, the possibilities too numerous. Robert endured the rest of the audience session, hearing petitions about farmland disputes and minor squabbles between lords. None of it felt real compared to the looming specter of draconic war. The Iron Throne felt more uncomfortable than ever, the swords of vanquished enemies pressing against his back and legs like silent reproach. After the session, he retired to a smaller solar, flanked by 2 Kingsguard knights. He intended to speak privately with Varys, but before he could settle, another interruption arrived. The queen herself, stepping into the solar with a swirl of her skirts. The Kingsguard withdrew, leaving them alone. Robert eyed her warily, for Cersei's moods of late had grown more unpredictable. She stood before him, hands folded in front of her. "Our children," she said, the words abrupt and pointed. "They are worried." Joffrey asks why the city is so tense, why everyone speaks of dragons and conspiracies. Marcella and Tommen are frightened by the stories they hear from servants. She paused. "You should address them." Robert scowled. He had scarcely thought of his children during these last frantic weeks. "They're safe in the Red Keep. That's all that matters. Tell them their father has everything in hand." Cersei's lips pressed together. "That won't ease their nightmares. They can't sleep for fear of some monstrous beast swooping down on them in the night." Robert rose, pacing the confines of the solar. "They are not babes. They should understand that fear is part of a king's life." She watched him with a cool gaze. "Perhaps, but is it wise to teach them that lesson now? I thought you wanted your heir to be strong, to project confidence. Instead, he's huddled behind the walls of his own home, trembling at every rumor." Robert flexed his hands in frustration. He could not deny the truth of it, yet he disliked the insinuation that his children were cowering. "Then have him come with me to the dragon enclosure if he wishes to see real beasts. Let him witness Jadefire and Ghostwing. Perhaps he'll feel less fear once he sees that we hold dragons of our own." Cersei arched an eyebrow. "Is that truly wise? The boy might be fascinated by their power. You and I both know how easily the taste of power can twist a soul." She glanced aside. "Joffrey is impressionable, and he admires boldness. If you show him the might of dragons, he might yearn to ride them himself." Robert grunted. "Better that than wetting his bed over false rumors. Let him see what we have. Let him see that House Baratheon will not be cowed." Cersei inclined her head. "Very well, I shall tell him." Then, a trace of calculation sharpened her gaze. "Though I wonder, my king, if we continue down this path, perhaps it would be best that our children learn the ways of dragons early. One day, Stormclaw could bear Joffrey, or Jadefire could bear Tommen, just as Targaryen princes once rode with impunity. Then no one could question their right to rule. The line of Baratheon would be unstoppable." Her words, though quietly spoken, made Robert's throat tighten. To place a child on a dragon's back, to teach him to master a creature of fire and fury, Did that not begin the same cycle that had created the Targaryen tyranny? He thought of the stories of Aegon's conquest, of Maegor the Cruel, of the dance of the dragons that tore the Seven Kingdoms apart. Yet he could not deny that having an heir who commanded a dragon might secure the realm for generations. Was it an unthinkable horror or a necessity? He realized Cersei was watching him, her gaze unwavering. He hardened his voice. "We'll cross that bridge when the time comes. For now, keep them safe." She studied him a moment longer, then gave a short nod and left, silent as a cat. Robert exhaled, feeling a flicker of relief mixed with the weight of new worries. Even the prospect of his children inheriting dragons had become a pawn in this dangerous game. And what if a Targaryen claimant rose across the sea, riding a dragon of their own? The realm would be plunged into a war of monstrous proportions. He slumped onto a chair, burying his face in his hands. Every solution he reached for seemed to spiral into fresh dangers. He recalled Ned's words, "The more you lean on dragonfire, the more destruction you sow." A bitter taste crept into Robert's mouth. He shook it off. The realm needed strength, not doubt. The next day, reports arrived from the Vale that a suspicious group had been discovered in the mountains near the Bloody Gate. Lord Yohn Royce sent a raven stating that they found paraphernalia suggestive of Valyrian worship. Incense, black candles, an altar with a carved dragon's head. No egg, though. The group scattered before Royce's men arrived. Elsewhere, in the Stormlands, one of Renly's bannermen claimed to have uncovered a hidden cache of Targaryen scrolls. Another near the Reach insisted he had glimpsed a red dragonet. Conflicting tales, swirling like ravens in a storm. Robert tried to parse the truth. He rode with Jadefire on short flights over the Crownlands when Stormclaw could not be used, though Jadefire often chafed at his attempts to mount her. The green dragon was smaller and more ill-tempered, making each flight precarious. On more than one occasion, Robert nearly lost his seat as Jadefire twisted midair in defiance. He cursed loudly, clinging to harness straps. The City Watch, gaping upward, whispered that the king's bond with Jadefire was weaker than the link he shared with Stormclaw. Still, the sight of a flying dragon patrolling the skies of King's Landing dissuaded smaller plots. The browbeaten small folk huddled in their homes at the thunder of wings. Robert raged inwardly at the necessity of terrifying his own people. Yet fear had become a currency he spent freely. Then, one dawn, a rider approached the city gates with urgent tidings from Dragonstone. Robert received him in the Red Keep's yard, with Jadefire perched on a balustrade nearby. The rider was salty-faced, exhausted from travel. He knelt and hurriedly began his report. Stannis Baratheon, Lord of Dragonstone, had discovered old passages beneath the fortress, vaults rumored to date back to the time of Aegon the Conqueror. Within them, Stannis's men found caches of Targaryen relics, among them a chest of black stone eggs. They had yet to be hatched, but the presence of such eggs was unmistakable. The rider extended a sealed letter from Stannis himself. Robert tore it open. His brother's stern, no-nonsense words practically leapt off the parchment. "I have taken possession of these eggs, which the Targaryens left hidden. Whether they can be hatched is unknown. I advise immediate action. I await your orders, though I remind you that Dragonstone is mine to govern. If you wish them destroyed, say so. If you wish them examined, I can arrange that too. But I warn you, brother, these are no trifling relics. The old Targaryen mania lingers in them." Robert swallowed, staring at the lines. Dragonstone was the seat of old Targaryen power, the place where Daenerys and Viserys had once hidden before fleeing across the sea. If eggs existed there, it might well confirm that the Targaryens or their loyalists had always planned a return. And what if these were not the only trove of eggs? How many more might be hidden in other corners of the realm? He quickly summoned Cersei, Varys, and Littlefinger, reading Stannis's letter aloud. Cersei was the first to speak. "Destroy them," she said bluntly. "Melt them in wildfire. Let us not risk another outbreak." Robert's first instinct was to agree, yet a troubling notion kept him silent. The crown currently possessed 3 living dragons, one of them wounded. If conspirators hatched more, and the crown lost any advantage, he might regret discarding potential assets. His mind flicked to the conversation with Cersei about their children. If these eggs could be harnessed for the crown, it might tip the balance of power in his favor forever. Varys tilted his head. The question is whether these eggs might be hatched at all. The old Targaryen secrets are not so easily replicated, even with sorcery. It may be that these eggs are dead stone and nothing more. Littlefinger gave a thin smile. Or they might birth more black horrors to plague us. A chance for greater power or greater doom. A gambler's choice. Robert barked a laugh, humorless. All of life seems a gambler's choice these days. He paced. I'll send word to Stannis. He is to guard them zealously and attempt no hatching. We'll bring them to King's Landing under heavy escort. Then we shall decide. I need to see them myself. Cersei's lips twitched in disapproval. And risk them falling into the wrong hands en route? Or hatching on the crossing? I'll post double or triple the guard, Robert growled. If the cultists want them, they'll have to face royal steel. Better that I keep them where I can see them. The queen inclined her head but made no further argument. Varys bowed. Littlefinger placed a finger to his lips thoughtfully, then shrugged. As you say, your grace. Thus, the message was dispatched, commanding Stannis to bring the eggs to the capital. Robert felt a tension coiling in his gut that no amount of drink could ease. He was gathering more dragon eggs to King's Landing, the very heart of the realm. A calculated risk, but if he could not control them, who could? Over the following days, the king's men readied a secure transport. Elite knights sailed to Dragonstone, armed with crossbows and sworn to secrecy. Robert suspected news would still leak out. The walls had ears, thanks to Varys's networks. Yet he hoped speed might outstrip rumor. Then, in a twist he had not foreseen, Ned Stark departed King's Landing in silence. Early one morning, without fanfare, he and his retinue rode out the gates, heading north. Robert received only a curt farewell by Raven, wherein Ned repeated that he could no longer watch events spiral. The letter ended. May the gods keep us from what you are awakening. Robert crumpled it in his fist and tossed it into a brazier. The final link to his old life, that simpler time of brotherhood and rebellion, felt severed. Shortly thereafter came a flurry of fresh tidings. The Vale claimed to have uncovered a half-formed cult in the Mountains of the Moon. The West dealt with outlaws who invoked Aegon's name. The Arbor reported strange lights off its shores. In truth, Robert suspected that half these rumors were the fantasies of frightened peasants. But each rumor had to be addressed, or it might fester into real danger. Cersei approached him in his private chambers one evening, her tone suspiciously gentle. My king, you cannot continue like this. You do not sleep, you barely eat. The realm demands much, but you must have a care for your own strength. Robert sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. I'll rest when the realm is safe. She stepped closer, letting her fingers brush across his broad shoulders. What if the realm never feels safe again? Will you burn yourself to ash? You have a duty to endure, Robert. He let her touch linger for a moment, recalling when their marriage was new, however brief the warmth had been. A king's duty, he muttered, is a crown of thorns, or a crown of dragon's teeth. He lifted his gaze to hers. I cannot stop now. Too much is in motion. She nodded slowly, then leaned down, pressing her lips to his. For a fleeting moment, he returned the kiss, letting the tension in his body unwind. When she drew back, her eyes gleamed. I will stand beside you, she said. We shall not let these traitors tear down what we have built. He noticed how she said we, as though they were united in a single ambition. Perhaps they were, though he wondered how much of it was truly shared purpose and how much was her thirst for power through their children. Still, the closeness offered a flicker of solace, a reminder that not everyone had abandoned him. A pang of regret cut through him that the only closeness left in his life was bound to a woman he scarcely trusted. Time churned onward. Eventually, a royal ship docked in King's Landing, bearing Stannis Baratheon and his cargo. Word spread quickly through the capital that something valuable had arrived. Robert personally oversaw the escort from the harbor to the Red Keep, a procession of knights on horseback, swords gleaming. Crowds lined the streets, muttering in awe or fear. Stannis rode at the head of the column, grim-faced, his jaw set. Behind him, in a heavy iron-bound wagon, lay the chest containing the Targaryen eggs. Robert caught Stannis's eye, nodding in greeting. "Brother," he said, "you did well." Stannis only inclined his head. "The chest is locked tight. No sign of tampering during the voyage. I posted a guard day and night." He lowered his voice. "If you ask me, we should have thrown them into the sea." Robert frowned. "And risk them washing ashore for some smugglers to find? I'd rather keep them under watch." Stannis's mouth pressed into a thinner line. "As you will." They proceeded up to the Red Keep. Guards swarmed the courtyard, forming a tight perimeter. The wagon was pulled inside, the chest unloaded with care. The entire realm seemed to hold its breath in that moment. Robert ordered the chest taken to a secure vault beneath the Red Keep, flanked by the Kingsguard and with alchemists at the ready in case something unexpected happened. Once inside the vault's torchlit gloom, Robert and Stannis, along with a handful of trusted advisors, Cersei, Varys, a couple of alchemists, had the chest unsealed. The lid creaked open, revealing 6 stone eggs nestled in straw and cloth. Each egg was about the size of a large skull. Their surfaces glimmered with subtle patterns, as though scales lay just beneath the stone. They varied in hue. Some had a hint of bronze, others a suggestion of midnight blue or onyx black. The air in the vault felt charged, as if a faint pulse of life thrummed beneath the shells. Robert inhaled sharply. It was one thing to speak of dragon eggs in the abstract, another to behold them physically. He felt a tug of awe, mingled with dread. He recalled the night Stormclaw's egg had cracked in the flames. Was that same potential locked within each of these? Cersei stared at them, her green eyes narrowing with fascination. Stannis stood rigid, as though confronting an enemy he could not strike. Varys watched with hooded curiosity. At last, Robert reached out a gauntlet hand to brush the nearest egg. He felt the cool, smooth surface beneath his fingertips. No warmth, no sign of life, yet that meant little. The knowledge gleaned from Stormclaw's hatching suggested that a spark of sorcery was required, a catalyst to quicken them. "We store them here," Robert said at length. "Day and night guards. If any attempt to remove them, kill them on sight. No one tries to hatch them without my explicit command." Stannis nodded. "I have no wish to remain near them. I will return to Dragonstone soon." Robert understood the subtext. Stannis loathed the idea of living so close to these relics, especially after the devastation they had seen. "As you wish, brother," he muttered. Cersei reached out, letting her fingertips linger on one of the eggs. Her face showed a flicker of something, ambition, perhaps. "They truly are beautiful," she mused softly. "So small and unassuming, yet they can raise cities." Robert clenched his jaw. "Beauty can be as deadly as any blade." He withdrew his hand. "Seal this vault. I'll post my loyal knights and gold cloaks. Any who come near without my permission will be declared traitors." Thus began a new tension in the Red Keep. The chest of Targaryen eggs became a prize of immeasurable potential. Some courtiers whispered that the king might hatch them and build a flight of dragons unstoppable by mortal armies. Others claimed he would soon crush them to dust. Few dared guess which path was more likely. Meanwhile, across the realm, the hunts and inquisitions continued. Reports of sightings multiplied. The more Robert tried to clamp down, the more fear ran rampant, and the more radical the Targaryen loyalists became. Houses once loyal to the crown began to show subtle signs of unease, if not outright defiance. Taxes soared, draining coffers that were already strained to feed the city and fund the watch. Peter Baelish, for his part, deftly manipulated loans and balances to keep the crown afloat, though Robert suspected the master of coin might be profiting from the chaos. The faith's stance hardened as well. The High Septon railed against sorcery, yet he also preached total obedience to King Robert, claiming that only the rightful ruler could guide them through this trial by fire. Some Septons, however, took a more extreme view, warning that dragons were an affront to the Seven, whether in the hands of traitors or the crown. Pockets of zealots called for purging all dragons from the realm, including those belonging to the king. A new faction calling itself the Flame of the Seven began smashing idol statues of dragons in certain septs, though so far they had not ventured to King's Landing. As the tides of unrest swelled, Robert grew increasingly reliant on daily updates from Varys. The Spider's Whispers infiltrated rumored cult cells, bribed local officials, and extracted confessions under threat or coin. Some eggs were seized in small raids. Whether they were true dragon eggs or worthless stones was not always clear. Nonetheless, each incident fueled the atmosphere of panic. The City Watch began storing barrels of wildfire in strategic locations, in case large-scale riots broke out or a dragon attacked. Through it all, Stormclaw slowly mended. One night, Robert visited the dragon enclosure to find Stormclaw out of his sandpit, testing his wings with a few slow beats. Jadefire and Ghostwing watched from their own perches, as if drawn to their elders' stirring. The black dragon rose a few feet off the ground, landed clumsily, then roared in frustration. Sparks of flame danced from his maw. Robert felt a surge of fierce pride, tempered by relief. Stormclaw was healing. Soon he might be airborne again, a formidable presence in the skies. But even that victory tasted bitter, for it meant Robert would again be the black silhouette overshadowing the city, relying on fear to keep the realm in check. Yet what choice did he have? He saw no path back to a gentler rule. Whenever he sat the Iron Throne, he recalled Rhaegar's final moments by the trident, how he had hammered that Targaryen prince into the river. Now, decades later, Rhaegar's legacy lived on through these eggs, these cults, this mania for draconic power. It felt like a cunning revenge from beyond the grave. Weeks stretched into months, each day taut with tension. The sun scorched King's Landing with a relentless heat, and the stench of uncollected waste churned in the narrower streets. Tempers ran high. The gold cloaks found themselves cracking down on brawls, rounding up alleged cultists, quelling bred riots. Rumors surfaced of an attempted infiltration of the Red Keep by men in black robes, though whether that was truth or rumor, Robert never learned. Varys insisted it was likely real, but the conspirators had been intercepted in time. Then, one oppressively hot afternoon, a raven arrived from Old Town with dire news. A ship had landed bearing travelers from Essos. Among them was a Pentoshi merchant who claimed to have encountered Daenerys Targaryen, living across the narrow sea with living dragons of her own. The letter offered few details, but it said the merchant swore that he had seen small but growing beasts with wings of black and red in her company, in some city near the edge of the Dothraki Sea. Robert's heart nearly stopped when he read the letter. Daenerys Targaryen. Had she truly hatched dragons as well? If so, then no matter how many conspiracies Robert snuffed out in Westeros, a far mightier threat might be brewing beyond the waves. He summoned his council, though the city was half mad with fever, and the flames of the setting sun cast a blood-red light across the council chamber. The discussion raged. Some, like Cersei, demanded an immediate dispatch of assassins to kill Daenerys before her beasts reached maturity. Others argued that it might be a rumor spread by those who sought to incite panic. Varys seemed uncertain. Littlefinger suggested that, rumor or truth, it was a convenient scare to tighten the crown's grip on the lords of Westeros. Robert felt caged, cornered on all sides by the specter of Targaryen dragons. At last, he gave the order, "Send the faceless men if we must. Pay them in gold. Daenerys Targaryen dies before she can land on our shores with a flight of dragons." He recognized the cruelty in his own words, but saw no alternative. The council parted with hushed acceptance. That night, Robert drank heavily, stumbling through the corridors of the Red Keep until he found himself once more before Balerian's massive skull in the dark recesses. He laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the gloom. "Are you satisfied?" He snarled at the ancient bones. "You Targaryens and your thrice-damned dragons. You haunt us still." He kicked at the skull, though it hurt his toe more than it harmed the old bone. Then he sank to his knees on the cold floor, feeling a wave of despair. The realm reeled under his rule, caught between a fear of dragons loyal to him and a terror of dragons loyal to others. This was not the reign he had once dreamed of when he overthrew the Mad King. He stayed there for a long time, eyes stinging with exhaustion and drink, until at last he hauled himself upright and stumbled away, leaving the old Targaryen relics in darkness. But though he walked away, he could not escape their shadow. As the scorching summer dragged on, events accelerated. The hunts netted more rumored eggs, some inert, others suspiciously warm to the touch. Red priests in King's Landing claimed it was a sign of the Lord of Light's growing presence, that the world was on the cusp of a grand conflagration. The High Septons spoke in apocalyptic terms, warning the faithful to remain loyal to the crown and the Seven. Whispers abounded that Robert Baratheon was no better than Aegon the Conqueror, forging an empire of fear. Amid this turmoil, Stormclaw finally regained the strength to fly. One morning, watchers on the city walls gasped as they saw the black dragon rise from the Red Keep's enclosure, wings beating heavily in the dawn light. Robert was mounted upon him, clad in black armor with gold studs, hammer strapped to his back. Stormclaw climbed into the sky, circling above the city thrice before unleashing a thunderous roar. The small folk in the streets cowered or cheered, or both, uncertain whether this signaled doom or protection. Robert felt the wind whip past his face, felt the surge of raw power in Stormclaw's muscles. A savage exultation bubbled up from within, mingled with a gnawing knowledge of all he might lose if the realm dissolved into multiple sides fighting with dragons. He guided Stormclaw west over the Blackwater, the sun glinting on the sea. The dragon's wing beats grew more confident, though it still favored the injured membrane. Robert scanned the horizon, as if expecting to see some monstrous silhouette rising to challenge him. But the sky remained empty except for gulls. For now, at least, he spent the better part of an hour aloft, reacquainting himself with the thrill of flight. A piece of him believed that if the realm saw him strong, astride Stormclaw again, they would not dare challenge his might. But deep down, he suspected that fear alone would not suffice to quell the madness unleashed. He turned the dragon back to the city, descending with a rush of heat and wind into the Red Keep's yard. Armored guards stood at attention, and Cersei waited with her retinue of Lannister men. She watched his landing intently, a small smile curving her lips. Perhaps she thought the realm was more secure now that Stormclaw was whole. Or perhaps she had another reason to smile. When Robert dismounted, he dismissed the onlookers, wanting a moment's quiet. He could not banish Cersei so easily, so they stood together, gazing at the black dragon as it folded its wings. "So," she said softly, "the might of House Baratheon is renewed." Robert replied, removing his helm. Sweat trickled down his brow, and the stale taste of fear still clung to his mouth. "For whatever good it may do." Her smile was cool, almost predatory. "All the good in the world, my king. If the Targaryens have dragons across the sea, let them come. Our storm is stronger." Robert remembered that the Targaryens once believed no force on earth could break them, yet the doom claimed Valyria and time unseated dynasties. Pride was a dangerous companion. Still, he held his tongue, for he had no desire to provoke an argument with the queen. Instead, he left her presence and returned to the castle interior, determined to finalize his instructions for the assassins heading across the narrow sea. Daenerys Targaryen, if truly alive with dragons, must die before she became a rallying banner for these cults at home. Days trickled by, each bringing new flickers of hope or dread. The eyes of the realm were fixed on King's Landing, waiting to see if Robert would indeed unleash a mass culling of traitors, or if a new open rebellion might flare. The climate seemed poised on a knife's edge, and the slightest push could send the Seven Kingdoms spiraling into civil war. Meanwhile, rumors began to swirl that Eddard Stark was mustering troops in the north, not in rebellion but as a defensive measure. The north was vast, unapproachable by dragons if the rumors were to be believed. Cold winds and high mountains offered some natural deterrent. Yet Robert wondered if Ned would remain neutral if the realm truly ignited. One stifling morning, Pycelle came to him in a flurry of excitement, brandishing a cracked old book. "Your Grace," the Grand Maester panted. "I found a reference that might prove vital. A mention of a secret means to quell dragons, some device or weapon dating back to before the Doom." He hurriedly flipped pages, revealing a half-faded passage describing a rumored horn of binding, said to have existed in ancient Valyria. Pycelle's eyes shone. If such an artifact could be found, it might let you control or kill any dragon, no matter who hatched it. Robert glowered at the mention of more sorcery. "Another old legend? We have no time for half-baked fantasies, Maester." Pycelle wrung his hands. "Yes, but the text specifically references attempts by the Freehold to create horns that could bend dragons to their will. Perhaps the Targaryens brought one to Westeros. It might be hidden in some corner of Dragonstone, or another Targaryen stronghold. If you possessed such a horn, Your Grace, you could neutralize any threat." Robert's first impulse was to dismiss it as nonsense. But then he recalled the mania for forging alliances with arcane knowledge that had led him to Stormclaw's birth. Was it truly any more outlandish to seek a dragon-controlling horn? It might be a weapon of last resort, a way to ensure the Targaryens or cultists could not challenge him. "Keep searching," Robert said grudgingly, "but do not speak of this to any but me." Pycelle nodded fervently. "Yes, Your Grace, I shall be discreet." So the net of secrets widened. Robert mused on the possibility of a horn that could command or kill dragons, imagining how that might reshape the war to come. If it existed, and if he found it first, he could crush all who opposed him. But if cultists found it, a shiver ran through him. He resolved to mention it only to the most trusted circles, perhaps not even that. By the time the harvest approached, the realm stood on the brink. The fields around King's Landing bore fewer crops than usual, battered by scorching heat and the disruptions of war. Rebellion smoldered in pockets. The crown's gold was scarce, devoured by the rising costs of watch patrols and hush money to keep certain fractious lords in line. Robert had never felt so beset by enemies within and without. Yet, ironically, he possessed more raw power than any ruler since the days of old Valyria, with living dragons under his command. One evening, as the sun set in a fiery display over Blackwater Bay, Robert climbed atop Stormclaw once more. The black dragon, mostly healed, let out a growl that resounded through the courtyard. Robert guided him aloft, the swirl of wind buffeting the watchers below. He urged Stormclaw higher, higher, until the Red Keep seemed a toy castle beneath them. The wind roared, carrying the stench of the city away. For a moment, he soared above the turmoil, above the conspiracies, tasting the raw thrill of flight. But it was fleeting. Even up here, he could not escape what waited below. He guided Stormclaw out over the wide waters of Blackwater Bay, the reflection of the dying sun painting the waves red. The dragon's rhythmic wing beats rumbled beneath him. In that hush, Robert let himself imagine a different world, one where the Targaryens had never discovered dragons, where men settled differences with swords alone, and the threat of unstoppable fire-breathing monsters did not loom over them all. If only he could will that world into being. But no, that was a child's fancy. He was King Robert Baratheon, and his realm was steeped in the legacy of Dragonfire, both Targaryen and now Baratheon-born. The sun dropped lower, crimson on the horizon, as though it, too, bled for Westeros. Robert turned Stormclaw back toward the city. The black silhouette of the Red Keep beckoned, a fortress shaped by centuries of Targaryen rule and conquest, now twisted by his own quest for power. As the dragon descended, Robert's heart felt like a lead weight. The saga he had unleashed was far from concluded. In the shadows of crumbling castles, in hidden vaults and scattered strongholds, the seeds of dragonry still lay, waiting for the right spark. Somewhere across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen or another might be stoking those fires. Here at home, 1,000 lesser conspirators brewed their own madness. And in the vault beneath the Red Keep, 6 silent eggs promised unimaginable possibilities. Robert Baratheon had indeed revived Aegon's conquest traditions, forging a new era of dragons in Westeros. Now, he would have to grapple with the consequences until his dying breath. Stormclaw landed amid the flurry of torches and servants rushing to attend the king. Robert slid from the saddle, gazed distant. He met the eyes of a Kingsguard who bowed, asking if he needed anything. Robert only shook his head. When he entered the Red Keep's halls, the suffocating weight of what lay ahead nearly buckled his knees. Yet he strode on, unyielding, for a king who dabbled in dragons could never again afford to appear weak. As the keep's great doors shut behind him, Robert felt the hush of the night settle. Beyond these walls, in the towns and hamlets, in the mountains and on the rocky shores, men whispered of living nightmares with scales of black and green and white, beasts that would tear the sky asunder if loosed. They muttered that the realm stood on the cusp of a second doom, or a second conquest, or something worse than either. Only time would tell which prophecy would unfold. But all knew that the heart of this tempest lay in King's Landing, where Robert Baratheon, once the rebel who slew a dragon prince, had become the Lord of Dragons himself. Thus, the Seven Kingdoms waited, breath abated, for the next turn of fate's wheel, unaware that each passing day drew them closer to the conflagration Robert had unwittingly unleashed. For shadows lengthened in corners unseen, alliances formed in silence, and wings of scale and flame spread across the horizon. Whatever came next, the realm would face it with trembling hearts, for the Age of Dragons had returned, and the price of such power would be paid in blood and fire.